My Lords, this is my first occasion to speak in this debate on the 8th day, and as I said at second reading, I have concentrated and will continue to concentrate on the issues relating to homeschooling parents and their pupils. It was therefore very heartening to hear from the noble Lord Lucas his very strong endorsement of home education. It was also very helpful of my noble friend the Minister to intervene when she did, and it gives me the opportunity at the beginning of my short speech that there should always be a register. And Baroness, noble Lady Baroness Baron may remember I brought, when she was in the Department of Education, I don't know if she's listening to me at the moment, but I did bring to her homeschooling mothers, and the issue that I have on behalf of the homeschooling mothers is not an issue whether there should be a register or not. The ample reasons that my noble friend the Minister gave in her speech just now, I wholly endorse, and yes, there should be a register. But the problem is, and these are the words I used in second reading, the trouble is the provisions relating to homeschooling in this bill are too long and too complicated. We have certain difficulties in the conduct of this debate. First of all, there are several amendments which are not on the issue of homeschooling, and the other one that noble Lord Frost identified, were not taking things in the order of the bill. We've already jumped into clause 31, and the first clause in the bill on homeschooling is clause 30. As an omnibus, that there are altogether 4 clauses relating to homeschooling in this bill, clauses 30, 31, 32, and 33. And those are the clauses. It would be much more convenient if we'd taken in order. My Lords, I think the best thing I can do at this stage, being the first occasion I have spoken in this bill, if I address your Lordships on homeschooling and the homeschoolers and their parents. My Lords, altogether, there are roughly 1% of children eligible for state school education. Rather, putting it this way, of all children eligible for state education, the homeschooling only accounts for 1%. In England, in the academic year 24-25, there were altogether children in state schools 9,092,073. So that makes the total of homeschooling parents to be in the region of 90,000 to 91,000, a substantial number of pupils, and a surprising number of pupils, but that's how the arithmetic works. Many of the homeschooling mothers, but by no means all, are university educated, that they group together in what they call cooperatives, and so the number of children being educated often goes around the figure of 7 to 8 pupils per grouping, and sometimes on special subjects that the homeschooling mothers can gather together 20 to 30 pupils at the same time. During each term, homeschooling parents have on average 3 educational visits to London museums and other places of education. Homeschooling allows also, and this is another feature of homeschooling, it allows the teaching of subjects which are not available in the state system. For example, classics, and schooling in music and drama, which again are not always available in state schools. There was a very good example given to the Minister when I was able to meet him that's Stephen Morgan, with some homeschooling mothers, and one cited the case of finding an Oxford graduate because she wanted to include classics in the education of one or more of her children, and how she found an Oxford graduate who could take on that task. The reasons for homeschooling is better education, education of subjects that are not available in state schools, and sometimes the need to take a child out of a state school for one unhappiness or another. So I think we can all understand, my lords, that homeschooling is a big, big commitment. This is Lord Lucas recognised that, and that homeschooling mothers are very busy in their prime role of education of their children, and therefore to involve them in extensive bureaucracy, as proposed in this bill, is wrong, and that is what I'm opposing. My lords, as I said in second reading, sorry, am I jumping up too quickly? Thank you. For once I've got the procedures right in this House. My lords, as I said in second reading, and I repeated earlier this afternoon, it is my contention on behalf of the school parents, the homeschool parents, that the provisions in this bill are too long and too complicated. And to that end, to get it in the right order, that I tabled a resistance to standing part of Clause 30 that appears in the Marshall list after Amendment 225, and I also tabled for Clause 31 Amendment 233A. But, my lords, perhaps we could look at the whole. And the whole is this, and I have argued against these long and complicated provisions in this bill relating to the homeschooling parents because they are frightfully oppressive on the homeschooling parents and in many ways unworkable, and that's because of the complicated language that is used in this bill. My lords, to take a look at it as a whole, that the homeschooling provisions in this bill cover clauses 30 to 33. They cover 29 pages, from pages 50 to 79 of this bill, which in turn contain 17 very large subclauses to be placed in section 434 or 436 of the Education Act of 1996. So the further complication is not only do you have to have this bill or this act when it becomes an act in your hands, but you have to go back to the 1996 Act. My lords, again, to take things in order, referring to clause 436C, which appears on pages 50 and 51 of the bill, there appears the definition of a relevant child. And the relevant child is described, and this is 43A, subparagraph 2, is described as a child of compulsory school age. The child is a registered pupil at a school, and conditions A and B are to be met. So we go on to condition A, and that focuses on send children, and then we go on to condition B, and that relates to children who are subject to inquiries under Section 47 of the Children Act 1989. But thereafter we're left stranded because they are specific to two types of relevant children, but the ordinary relevant children, fulfilling the requirements of being a child of compulsory school age and as a child registered in it, is simply not covered. And that is, well, I don't know if the Minister can guide me to this, but at the moment, as you read it, and you need a cold towel around your head, to read these provisions. And then, my lords, things get more serious in clause 31 and in paragraph 436C, 1E, which is on page 55 of the bill. And here that we have identified all of the information that the homeschooling parent has to provide. First of all, the names and addresses of any individuals or organisations involved in providing education to the child. Secondly, a description of the type of each provider of education for the child. Thirdly, the postal address of each person where that education is provided, or the website or email address. And fourthly, the total amount of time the child spends receiving that education and the amount of time the child spends receiving that education. A very large omnibus inquiry and a very large omnibus piece of information that is sought. And this, my lords, covers, for example, evening education, evening tuition in music. It covers Sunday schools that the pupil may be appearing. It covers, for another example, physical education at a local club. None of this, my lords, none of this information is sought from children at state schools and only sought for homeschooling children. And then it gets even worse. And this time it's not on the parent, but it gets even worse on subsection 2 on page 55, where there are 27 requirements on the local authority to provide information for the register. And it gets even worse if you examine the bill further. The information has to be provided within 15 days, that's clause 436D, 2 little b. Any changes to that information has to be provided within 15 days, and that's under clause 436E, 5 and 6. I'm sorry to have all these complications, but that is the complications of the bill that I'm complaining about. And then thirdly, if the homeschooling parent doesn't provide that information, it's subject to monetary penalties under clause 436E and 8. So let's wait a moment. That these are all being applied, or as the bill is written at the moment, all being applied on the homeschool parents who are busy teaching the child. They are not or should not be involved in this type of bureaucracy. My lords, I've taken this complaint up already. I wrote a letter to my noble friend the minister, and through her kindness, a meeting was arranged on the 17th of June with the minister in the government who's actually responsible for these provisions, Stephen Morgan. It was a very agreeable and sensible meeting, and I had with me 3 homeschooling parents, which he treated with great courtesy and listened very carefully to what they had to say. So I have some hope that my noble friend the minister, working with Mr. Stephen Morgan, her colleague in the Department of Education, will realise these provisions are too onerous and will enter into discussion sometime perhaps in August so that we can together work out what would be sensible for being required of homeschooling parents. I have made it quite plain earlier when I spoke in the chamber that there should be a register. That is not the issue. The issue is what demands are made relating to that register. My lords, I will just leave it to my noble friend the minister. She may say that she would like to think about it, and that would be very pleasant. But I do hope that she will not get into a position of denial.
May I just rise to ask a question on this set of amendments? The registers, and I've not spoken on this group before, so I'm absolutely supportive of the bill. It's long overdue, and I very much welcome it. But in the spirit of wanting to do this as practically as possible, I do think it's around this area where we need to make sure that we're not being too onerous on parents and local authorities, that it makes sense. And from what, in respect of what's just been said, I mean, the parents, if I'm right, just have to provide the information under 4361, not 4362, which is a much longer list. And in fairness, it says, to the extent that the local authority has the information or can responsibly obtain it. So I'm not overly worried about that. But the question I wanted to ask is, which I'm not sure where it is in the bill. I think the questions that are being asked are not unreasonable as long as the list doesn't grow. And we're pretty firm with local authorities about not sneaking extra questions in that's not required. But how often does it have to be updated by parents? The question I had in mind really was, in educating your own child, if for some reason you wish to do an area of learning next month and you approach somebody new to do that area of learning, maybe for 1 hour a week, would you have to notify in advance, or would you do an annual review or whatever? I think it's around that area where we need to be really clear as a sign of good faith that we're not deliberately trying to make it onerous. We're not some kind of checking that means you can't ever make a mistake. I'm just picking the title, I may say to the Minister, of an example where if we're not careful, the rules could be misinterpreted and it could get more cumbersome than we actually intended it to be. But other than that, I don't on the whole think that 4361 is unreasonable or time-consuming as long as it is interpreted in the way that it was intended.
Before my noble friend sits down, she was a most distinguished Secretary of State for Education, and I'm very grateful to her for intervening in this debate. To answer directly her questions, she said that she was only really focusing on 436C, subparagraph 1. And that is indeed the paragraph which I particularly drew your Lordship's attention in covering little e. I have to disagree with her to say that that's okay. I don't think it's okay at all. And she did ask what was kind of the onward obligation to provide further information when, let's say, you brought in an extra teacher or the like. The answer is that you're, according to the Act, or according to the bill, that there's a duty to inform the register every time within 15 days. So there is onward responsibility. As for subsection 2, she's quite right, that refers to the local authority, not to the parents. I pointed it out because there's an enormous number of requirements on the local authority in the registration process, requirements that actually number 27. And that's an illustration of how complicated this bill has become and how unworkable it is in its present state.